It was dawn on September 12, 1683. The walls of Vienna lay in ruins. The city had been under siege for 2 months. Within the shattered fortifications, the exhausted defenders gazed at the horizon with a mixture of despair and hope. On the other side, the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled in Europe prepared for the final assault. 200,000 men armed to the teeth, cannons that had reduced the city's defenses to rubble, and the determination to finally conquer the jewel of Central Europe. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha was confident. Victory seemed inevitable. But something was about to happen that would completely change the course of European history. A secret weapon was coming, a force so powerful, so devastating, that it would turn what should have been the greatest Ottoman victory into one of the most catastrophic defeats any empire had ever suffered. This is the story of the Battle of Vienna. But more than that, this is the story of how a single military force changed the fate of entire civilizations in a matter of hours. Prepare to discover the secret weapon that saved Europe and destroyed Ottoman ambitions once and for all. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future military history videos, and leave a comment with the time you watched this video. Now let's go back to the year 1683. To fully understand what happened in Vienna, we need to go back a few decades. The Ottoman Empire was at the height of its power. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Ottomans had expanded in every direction. They controlled the Middle East, North Africa, the Balkans, and had penetrated deep into Central Europe. Every sultan dreamed of conquering Vienna, the city considered the gateway to the heart of Western Europe. If Vienna fell, nothing would stop the Ottomans from marching on Germany, France, and beyond. The Habsburg Empire, which controlled Austria and much of Central Europe, was in a desperate position. Emperor Leopold I faced threats from all sides. The French, under Louis XIV, the Sun King, were constantly pressing the Habsburgs' western borders. Protestants in northern Germany distrusted the Catholic Austrian emperor, and to the south and east, Ottoman power grew with each passing year. In 1681, the situation became critical. A Hungarian revolt against Habsburg rule gave the Ottomans the perfect excuse to intervene. Sultan Mehmed IV decided it was time to finally conquer Vienna. He appointed his ambitious Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha, to lead the campaign. Kara Mustafa was a man obsessed with glory and wealth. He saw the conquest of Vienna not just as a military victory, but as an opportunity to amass unimaginable treasures. He began assembling the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever fielded. 200,000 men answered the call. There were the Janissaries, the elite Ottoman infantry, highly trained and fanatical soldiers who formed the core of the imperial army. There were the Sipahis, the heavy cavalry, warriors mounted on magnificent Arabian horses, armed with lances, sabers, and composite bows. There were also units from Crimea, Tatar vassals known for their ferocity. Regiments from Wallachia, Moldavia, and Transylvania joined the horde. And there were tens of thousands of irregular troops, raiders, and adventurers who followed the army in hopes of plunder and glory. But what made this army truly terrifying was its artillery. The Ottomans had pioneered the use of gunpowder cannons in Europe. They brought with them 300 artillery pieces, including enormous bombards capable of launching stone projectiles weighing hundreds of kilograms. These cannons had demolished the walls of Constantinople 2 centuries earlier. Now they would be used against Vienna. In the spring of 1683, this colossal army began its march. News of its approach spread terror throughout Central Europe. City after city surrendered without a fight. Those that resisted were razed to the ground. The Ottoman army advanced like a relentless flood, destroying everything in its path. In July, they reached the gates of Vienna. The city had only about 15,000 defenders, a mix of imperial soldiers, urban militias, and volunteers. Against 200,000 invaders, the chances of victory seemed impossible. Emperor Leopold fled the city, leaving command in the hands of Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, an experienced and determined soldier. Starhemberg knew his only hope was to hold out long enough for reinforcements to arrive. But where would these reinforcements come from? Europe was fragmented, riven by religious and political rivalries. Convincing the German, Polish, and Italian princes to unite against their common enemy would be nearly impossible. But there was one man determined to do just that: Pope Innocent XI saw the siege of Vienna not just as a political crisis, but as a holy war. He began a frantic diplomatic campaign, sending emissaries to every court in Catholic Europe. He argued that if Vienna fell, all of Christendom would be in danger. He offered money, religious dispensations, and his moral support to any prince who would come to the aid of the besieged city. Slowly, his message began to resonate. The first to respond was John Sobieski, the King of Poland. Sobieski was one of the greatest military commanders of his time, a man who had spent his entire life fighting the Ottomans in the Ukrainian steppes. He understood the Ottoman mentality, knew their tactics, and most importantly, was unafraid of them. When the call for help came from Vienna, Sobieski saw an opportunity not only to save Christendom, but to cover Poland with glory. He immediately began mobilizing his army, and it was here that the secret weapon began to take shape. The Polish army possessed something no other European army possessed in such quantity or quality: heavy cavalry known as the Winged Hussars. These units were the elite of the elite, warriors who had evolved over centuries of constant warfare on Europe's eastern borders. Each Winged Hussar was a Polish nobleman, a member of the warrior aristocracy known as the Szlachta. From boyhood, they were trained in the arts of war. They learned to ride before they could walk, to wield a lance before they could write. By the age of 20, a Winged Hussar was a mounted killing machine. But what made the Hussars truly unique was their equipment. Each knight wore a full suit of armor, not the heavy Gothic armor of medieval knights, but a lighter Eastern armor made of overlapping steel plates that offered exceptional protection without sacrificing mobility. Over the armor, they wore leopard or tiger skins, not for show, but because it was believed the skins offered additional protection against sabers and arrows. On their backs, attached to a special structure, were wings, large wooden structures covered with eagle feathers. They created a terrifying whistle when the knight galloped. This psychological sound was calculated to break the enemy's morale even before impact. The Winged Hussars' primary weapon was the kopia, a hollow wooden lance about 6 meters long. Unlike Western European lances, which were held firmly under the arm, the kopia was balanced in the hand, allowing the rider to use it more as a thrusting stick than a shock lance. This technique allowed the hussar to thrust the lance through multiple enemies in a single charge, withdraw the lance, and use it again. When the lance broke, the hussar drew one of several sabers he carried, razor-sharp curved swords that could sever a limb with a single blow. But the hussars' true strength lay not merely in their equipment or individual training. It lay in their discipline and tactics. Unlike most cavalry of the time, which charged in disorderly formations, the hussars attacked in tight formation, knee to knee, in successive waves. The first line struck the enemy like a hammer, breaking the formation. And then the second line passed through, exploiting the gap. And then the third line. And the fourth. It was a perfectly coordinated killing machine, capable of destroying entire armies in minutes. The Ottomans had heard of the hussars, of course. They had faced Polish cavalry before, but they had never seen the Winged Hussars in their full power, charging down the mountain in their thousands, over perfect terrain. They had no idea what was coming. While Sobieski was assembling his army in Poland, the situation in Vienna was becoming desperate. Ottoman cannons bombarded the city day and night. Entire sections of the walls had collapsed. The Ottomans dug tunnels beneath the fortifications, filled them with gunpowder, and blew them up, creating breaches that their soldiers tried to exploit. Every day there were assaults, brutal hand-to-hand combat in the ruins of the walls. The defenders repelled each attack, but at a terrible cost. Casualties mounted, ammunition dwindled, food was running low. Inside the city, civilians and soldiers alike were dying of hunger and disease. Some spoke of surrender, but Starhemberg refused to give up. He knew help was on the way. He just needed to hold on a little longer. Every night he climbed the crumbling walls and looked west, searching for signs of a relief army. And every night, he saw only darkness and the fires of the Ottoman camp stretching as far as the eye could see. Across the lines, Kara Mustafa was growing impatient. The siege was lasting much longer than he had planned. He had expected Vienna to fall within weeks. Now months had passed. His men were growing restless. Reports were arriving that a relief army was forming in the north. But Kara Mustafa was confident. He had 200,000 men. Even if a relief army arrived, he could easily divide his forces, keeping half to continue the siege and using the other half to destroy the relief forces. He had made a crucial mistake, however. He completely underestimated the size and composition of the force coming to Vienna's rescue. John Sobieski was not coming alone. Responding to the Pope's appeals, princes from all over Germany had sent contingents. Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, brought an imperial army. John George III of Saxony sent troops. Maximilian II Emmanuel of Bavaria came with Bavarian regiments. Even small German principalities sent what they could. By early September, these forces had gathered in the hills north of Vienna. The relief army totaled about 70,000 men, less than half the size of the Ottoman force, but it was united by a common purpose and led by one of Europe's greatest commanders. On September 8th, the relief army began its final march toward Vienna. They moved through the Vienna heights, rugged, forested terrain that made progress slow and difficult. The Ottomans knew they were coming, but due to the terrain they couldn't see exactly where they were or how strong they were. Kara Mustafa made his second crucial mistake. Instead of lifting the siege and moving his army into a strong defensive position, he decided to divide his forces exactly as he had planned. He kept most of his army occupied with the siege and sent only a blocking force to deal with the relief army. In the following days, there were skirmishes in the hills. Ottoman advance units tried to slow the relief army's advance, but were constantly repelled. On September 11th, the relief army emerged from the forests and took up position on the heights north of Vienna. For the first time, the two armies could see each other. On the Ottoman side, there was confusion and concern. The relief army was larger than expected. And on the right flank, gleaming in the afternoon sun, were the armor and wings of the Polish Hussars. 18,000 heavy horsemen, the largest elite cavalry force assembled in a single place since the Crusades. Sobieski studied the battlefield with an expert's eye. The terrain completely favored his secret weapon. From his perch on Kahlenberg Hill, the terrain sloped down in a long, relatively gentle slope toward the Ottoman lines. It was perfect terrain for cavalry. He could hurl his hussars down the hill at top speed, with gravity adding devastating force to the charge. The Ottomans were positioned on the low ground, their backs to the Danube River. If their line broke, they would have nowhere to retreat. It was the ideal tactical situation. Sobieski gave the order to attack at dawn. The night of September 11th to 12th was tense. Both sides knew that the next day would decide the fate of Vienna, perhaps of all Europe. On the Christian lines, priests heard confessions and blessed the soldiers. On the Ottoman lines, imams led prayers. Kara Mustafa was worried now. He had underestimated the enemy, but it was too late to change strategy. He ordered his men to prepare to receive the attack. The dawn of September 12th arrived cold and foggy. At first light, the relief army began to descend from the hills. The Germans and Austrians formed the center and left, advancing in infantry and cavalry formations. The Poles remained on the right. Sobieski kept his hussars in reserve, waiting for the perfect moment. The battle began at 8 in the morning with artillery exchanges. The Ottoman guns, which had been positioned to bombard Vienna, had to be quickly repositioned to meet the new threat. But many were in fixed positions and could not be moved in time. Meanwhile, inside Vienna, Starhemberg heard the cannons to the north and understood what was happening. Help had arrived. He ordered his men to sortie, attacking the Ottoman lines from inside the city, to prevent Kara Mustafa from sending reinforcements to confront the relief army. Throughout the day, the battle intensified. German and Austrian units clashed with the Ottoman lines. The Janissaries fought fiercely, holding their positions. For hours, the outcome remained uncertain. The Ottoman center was holding. If they could hold out until nightfall, they could reorganize and continue the fight the next day. But Sobieski was waiting. He watched the battle from above, calculating the exact moment to unleash his secret weapon. Around 3 in the afternoon, he saw what he was looking for. The Ottoman center was fully engaged. Their reserves had been committed, and the Ottoman left flank, the part of the army directly below the Polish position, was beginning to falter under the pressure. It was time. Sobieski gave the order. 18,000 winged hussars mounted their horses. They formed into lines, regiment after regiment, stretching over a mile wide. Sobieski rode along the formation, inspecting his men. Then he took his place at the front, in the first line. The King of Poland would personally lead the charge. He raised his sword. The hussar's wings whispered in the wind, and then he lowered it, pointing at the enemy below. 18,000 horsemen began to move, first at a walk, then at a trot, and then, as the slope grew steeper, at a gallop. The ground shook beneath 60,000 hooves. The sound of wings created an unearthly roar, as if a storm were descending from the hills. The Ottomans on the left flank looked up and saw an avalanche of steel and fury descending upon them. Many simply broke and fled before the impact, but those who remained faced hell on earth. The first line of hussars struck the Ottoman lines like a meteor. 6-meter lances pierced armor, bodies, shields, and multiple men in a single thrust. Horses trampled infantry. Sabers flashed, severing heads and limbs. And before the Ottomans could react, the second line of hussars swept past the first, widening the gap. And then the third, and the fourth. Within minutes, the entire Ottoman left flank had been annihilated. The hussars did not stop. They continued on, wheeling inward, attacking the Ottoman center from behind. Panic spread through the Ottoman lines. Units that had fought courageously all day suddenly found themselves attacked from the front, flanks, and rear. The center shattered. Ottoman soldiers ran in all directions, seeking escape. But there was nowhere to go. Behind them lay the Danube. Ahead, the hussars rode through it like reapers through wheat. The battle turned into a massacre. Kara Mustafa tried to reorganize his troops, but it was futile. His army was in utter panic. He ordered a retreat, but the order came too late. His best units, the Janissaries, the Sipahis, were surrounded and destroyed. His cannons were captured. His camp, filled with the treasures he had plundered on his march through Hungary, was overrun by Christian soldiers hungry for revenge and plunder. By nightfall, the Ottoman army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. Of the 200,000 men who had besieged Vienna, at least 15,000 lay dead on the battlefield. Tens of thousands more were killed during the ensuing pursuit. The rest were scattered, fleeing in disarray back to Hungary. The relief army had lost fewer than 2,000 men. It was one of the most complete and decisive victories in military history. Inside Vienna, the citizens who had resisted for 2 months emerged from the ruins of their walls and wept with joy. The city was saved. Europe was saved, and all thanks to a cavalry charge, a secret weapon that had utterly destroyed the largest army the Ottoman Empire had ever assembled. But the story doesn't end there. The consequences of the Battle of Vienna reverberated for centuries. For the Ottoman Empire, it was the beginning of the end. Kara Mustafa fled back to Constantinople, where he was strangled on the Sultan's orders for his failure. But the damage was done. The myth of Ottoman invincibility had been shattered. In the following years, the Habsburgs and their allies launched a counter-offensive, reconquering all of Hungary and pushing the Ottomans back into the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire would never again seriously threaten Central Europe. For Poland, it was a moment of supreme glory. John Sobieski became a hero throughout Christendom. Pope Innocent XI called him the savior of civilization. But ironically, this glory was short-lived. Poland had expended enormous resources on the Vienna campaign and received little territorial reward. In the following decades, weakened by internal conflicts, Poland would be gradually dismembered by its neighbors, disappearing from the map for more than a century. For the Winged Hussars, Vienna was their swan song. The charge of September 12, 1683, was the largest and most successful heavy cavalry charge in history, but it was also one of the last. The world was changing. Firearms were becoming more efficient. Infantry tactics were evolving. Within a few decades, the era of heavy cavalry as a decisive force on the battlefield would be over. The Winged Hussars would fade, becoming a legend, a reminder of a more heroic and brutal age. But what a legend they became. For centuries afterward, stories of the Charge of Vienna were told and retold. Paintings were made depicting the avalanche of winged horsemen descending from the hills. Poems were written, songs were composed. The charge became a symbol of courage, determination, and triumph against impossible odds. And there are lessons from the Battle of Vienna that transcend its specific historical context. The battle demonstrated the power of unity in the face of a common threat. Europe in 1683 was deeply divided. Catholics and Protestants had massacred each other for over a century in the wars of religion. German princes fought constantly among themselves. France and the Habsburgs were mortal enemies. But in the face of the Ottoman threat, these divisions were temporarily set aside. Poles, Germans, Austrians, and Italians fought side by side. And together they achieved what none of them could have done alone. The battle also demonstrated the importance of leadership. John Sobieski was an inspiring leader, a king who asked his men to do nothing he wasn't willing to do himself. He personally led the cavalry charge, putting his life on the line no less than that of the humblest soldier. This kind of leadership by example, is rare and precious. It inspires loyalty and courage in a way that no amount of oratory or command can match. And the battle demonstrated that military technology and tactics matter enormously. The Winged Hussars were not just ordinary cavalry. They were the result of centuries of military evolution, tactical refinement, and intensive training. They were a highly specialized weapon, designed for a specific role, and when used in the right terrain at the right time by a commander who understood how to employ them, they were absolutely devastating. Kara Mustafa had a larger army, but Sobieski had the right tool for the job, and he knew exactly how to use it. But perhaps Vienna's most profound lesson concerns the decisive moments in history. There are times when the course of entire civilizations depends on decisions made by a few individuals in a very short period of time. If Sobieski had not answered the call for help, if the German princes had not put aside their differences, if Starhemberg had surrendered even a few days earlier, history would have been completely different. Vienna would have fallen. The Ottoman Empire would have consolidated its control over Central Europe. The balance of power would have shifted dramatically. Who can say how Europe and indeed the world would be different today? But these decisions were made. These men rose to meet the challenge. And one September afternoon on a hillside outside Vienna, history changed direction. Not because of abstract economic trends or inevitable historical forces, but because of concrete human choices and the courage of men willing to risk everything for what they believed in. When we visit Vienna today, it's hard to imagine that this elegant city, with its Baroque palaces and charming cafes, was once the site of one of history's most desperate battles. The walls that Starhemberg defended so fiercely have long since disappeared, replaced by the Ringstrasse, the grand boulevard that circles the city's historic center. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces of those terrible days. There are plaques marking where the walls once stood. There are museums with artifacts from the battle, Ottoman cannons, hussar armor, swords and flags. And there are monuments. On Kahlenberg Hill, where Sobieski and his hussars began their historic charge, stands a church dedicated to the memory of the battle. From its terrace, you can look down and see the entire battlefield spread out below you. You can trace the path of the charge, from the top of the hill to the plains below. And if you use your imagination, you can almost hear the thunder of hooves, the roar of wings, the clash of steel against steel. The Battle of Vienna also had unexpected cultural effects that persist to this day. When the victorious Christians raided the abandoned Ottoman camp, they found something curious among the loot: sacks and sacks of coffee beans. The Ottomans were heavy consumers of coffee, a beverage still relatively unknown in Europe at the time. A clever Polish businessman named Jerzy Franciszek Kulczycki claimed some of these sacks as part of his reward for serving as a messenger during the siege. He used the coffee to open Vienna's first coffee shop. The business prospered. Soon, coffee shops were springing up all over the city. The Viennese coffee culture, which would become famous worldwide, was born from the ruins of the Ottoman defeat. There's also a legend, likely apocryphal but charming, about the croissant's origin. It's said that Vienna bakers, working at night and the first to hear the Ottomans digging tunnels under the walls, created a crescent-shaped bread, the Ottoman symbol, to commemorate the victory over the invaders. True or not, the story captures how deeply the battle penetrated European cultural consciousness. But let's get back to the secret weapon itself. What made the Winged Hussars so effective? It wasn't just their impressive equipment or superior training, though both were important. It was a combination of psychological, tactical, and technological factors that came together perfectly. Psychologically, the Hussars' appearance was calculated to terrify. The wings, the animal skins, the gleam of their armor all created an almost supernatural image. When thousands of them charged in unison, the effect was overwhelming. Enemy soldiers often broke and fled even before impact, not out of cowardice, but because their brains simply couldn't process the sight and sound of this approaching avalanche. It was a form of psychological warfare, and it was incredibly effective. Tactically, the Hussars represented the final evolution of shock cavalry. They had solved the fundamental problem that had always limited cavalry: what to do after the initial charge. Traditional cavalry charged, inflicted damage, but then often became trapped in close combat, losing their mobility and becoming vulnerable. The Hussars, with their long lances and multi-wave technique, could maintain momentum. They would pass through enemy lines in a wave, then reform and charge again. They could do this repeatedly, each charge devastating a new section of the enemy army. Technologically, they represented the perfect balance between protection and mobility. The Oriental armor they wore was strong enough to deflect most attacks, yet light enough not to exhaust their horses. Their lances were long enough to reach the enemy before the enemy could reach them, yet hollow enough to be wielded one-handed. Their horses were carefully bred and trained, capable of carrying the weight of a fully armed knight at top speed for considerable distances. And there was one final factor, perhaps the most important of all. The Winged Hussars were professionals. Each was a career warrior, trained since childhood. They fought together, trained together, knew each other's commands and maneuvers instinctively. This unit cohesion, this ability to operate as a single entity rather than as thousands of individuals, was what transformed a group of horsemen into a decisive military weapon. Compare this to much of the Ottoman army in Vienna. While the Janissaries were highly trained elite troops, much of the army was composed of provincial levies, irregular troops, and adventurers. They were brave and numerous, but lacked the cohesion and discipline of the Hussars. When the Polish formation reached their lines, they simply lacked the training or command structure to respond effectively. There's also an interesting aspect to the role of terrain in the battle. Sobieski chose his attack point with masterful care. Kahlenberg Hill offered exactly the kind of long, gradual slope that allowed the cavalry to build maximum speed. If the terrain had been steeper, the horses would have lost control. If it had been flatter, they wouldn't have gained enough speed. If it had been rough or covered in obstacles, the formation would have broken up. But the terrain was perfect, almost as if it had been specifically designed for a massed cavalry charge. Some historians argue that Sobieski was lucky, that he couldn't have predicted the terrain would be so favorable. But this underestimates his genius as a commander. He had spent days scouting the area, studying maps, and speaking with local guides. He knew exactly what kind of terrain he needed and deliberately positioned his army to take advantage of it. This wasn't luck. It was brilliant strategy. The battle also illustrates the importance of timing in military operations. Sobieski held his hussars in reserve for hours while the battle raged. Many commanders would have grown impatient and committed them sooner. But Sobieski waited until the moment was exactly right. He waited until the Ottoman reserves were committed, until the enemy flank was weakened, until the sun was in the right position to blind the Ottoman defenders as they looked up toward the approaching charge. Every detail was calculated. And then, when everything was perfectly aligned, he unleashed his secret weapon with devastating effect. There are fascinating eyewitness accounts of the charge. An Austrian officer in the center of the line described seeing the entire slope move, as if the mountain itself were descending on the Ottomans. He said the sound was deafening, not just the thunder of hooves, but the strange musical whistling of wings that created a terrifying symphony. Another account from a German soldier mentions that the hussars seemed to fly, not dig, moving so fast it was difficult to follow with the eyes. On the Ottoman side, surviving accounts speak of sheer terror. A Turkish chronicler described the hussars as mounted demons sent to punish the faithful. He wrote that no amount of courage could withstand such an onslaught, which was like trying to stand firm in the face of an earthquake or avalanche. Another Ottoman account blames the defeat on witchcraft, claiming that the Poles must have used black magic to give their horses supernatural speed and strength. These weren't mere superstitions. They reflected the psychological reality of facing a massed cavalry charge. Modern humans living in an age of mechanized warfare have difficulty comprehending the sheer visceral terror of facing a cavalry charge. Imagine being in an infantry formation. Armed with a musket you can fire perhaps once a minute, or a lance or a sword. You look up and see thousands of armored horsemen charging toward you, at 40 or 50 kilometers per hour. The ground shakes. The air is filled with dust and the sound of thunder. They are upon you in seconds. There is no time to think, only to react. And the instinctive reaction, programmed into our brains by millions of years of evolution, is to flee from threats larger and more powerful than ourselves. The Hussars exploited this instinct. They maximized every aspect of their appearance and attack to trigger that primal fear response. And it worked. Time and again, over decades of campaigning, they broke larger armies simply through the sheer force of the psychological terror they inspired. But it's important to note that the Hussars weren't invincible. They had weaknesses. In poor terrain, especially marshy or heavily wooded areas, they lost their advantage. Against disciplined infantry and prepared fortifications, they could be driven back with heavy casualties. And they were expensive to maintain and train, meaning that even wealthy Poland could only sustain a limited number of them. Vienna represented the height of Hussar power precisely because all the conditions were perfect. Excellent terrain, an enemy in an unfavorable position, and supreme leadership. It's fascinating to consider how the battle might have turned out differently if any of the key factors had changed. What if Kara Mustafa had lifted the siege when he learned a relief army was arriving? Instead of trying to fight on two fronts, he would have had time to choose a strong defensive position, perhaps one where the terrain negated the Polish cavalry's advantage. What if he had used his artillery more effectively against the charge? Cannons loaded with grape shot could have devastated the Polish formation. What if the weather had changed, bringing rain that would make the ground muddy and slow the horses? Any of these factors could have completely changed the outcome. But history doesn't deal in possibilities. It deals with what actually happened. And what happened on September 12, 1683, was that 18,000 Polish knights changed the course of European history in a single afternoon. The immediate military consequences were profound. The Ottoman Empire lost not only an army, but also its prestige. For centuries, the Ottomans had been feared as nearly invincible warriors. Now that aura had been shattered. European states that had paid tribute to the Ottomans for generations suddenly found the courage to resist. Within the empire itself, the defeat sparked political unrest and military reforms. The Janissaries, who had failed to stop the Hussars, were partly to blame and began to lose their privileged position. For the Habsburgs, the victory ushered in a golden age. With the Ottoman threat averted, they were able to consolidate their control over Central Europe. They reconquered Hungary, pushed into the Balkans, and established themselves as one of Europe's great powers. Vienna, which had been a frontier city under constant threat, became the shining heart of an expansive empire. The magnificent Baroque architecture, for which Vienna is famous today, was largely built in the century after the battle, financed by the wealth that flowed from newly conquered territories. The battle also had an impact on European diplomacy. It demonstrated that, when sufficiently motivated, European states could put aside their differences and cooperate against a common threat. This precedent would be remembered in future crises, and it established the principle that Europe as a whole had an interest in maintaining a balance of power, that no single power should be allowed to become dominant. From the Polish perspective, however, the results were mixed. Although Sobieski gained immortal glory, Poland as a state did not benefit proportionately. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was already in decline due to internal structural problems, especially its unique political system that gave each noble the power to veto any legislation. This system made reform or decisive action nearly impossible. In the decades after Vienna, while its neighbors, Prussia, Austria, and Russia, modernized and centralized, Poland remained fragmented. Eventually, these same neighbors who had fought alongside Poland in Vienna would divide it among themselves, wiping Poland off the map for over a century. There's a tragic irony in this. The weapon that saved Europe in Vienna couldn't save Poland itself. This illustrates a difficult truth about military power. Even the most formidable armed forces are useless without a stable political and economic base. Winged Hussars could win battles, but they couldn't solve the deep problems of Polish society. This is a lesson repeated throughout history, from Rome to many modern empires. The Battle of Vienna also marks a transitional moment in military history. It was one of the last times that heavy cavalry played a decisive role in a major European battle. The future belonged to infantry, armed with improved muskets, increasingly effective artillery, and eventually to linear formations and trench warfare. The romantic era of knights charging in glory was coming to an end. Within a century, cavalry would be reduced primarily to reconnaissance and pursuit roles. The Charge of Vienna was, in a sense, the last hurrah of a form of warfare that dated back to antiquity. But what a hurrah it was. Rarely in history has a single military action had such immediate and dramatic consequences. In a matter of hours, the fate of millions of people was altered. Entire regions changed hands. The balance of power between civilizations shifted. And all because a king had the foresight to come to the aid of a besieged city, brought with him the right weapon, and knew exactly how and when to use it. There is something deeply human and inspiring about the story of Vienna. It was not inevitable. It was not predestined. It required conscious choices by individuals in leadership positions. It required courage from thousands of ordinary soldiers willing to risk their lives. It required cooperation between peoples who had many reasons to distrust each other. And it required the kind of tactical brilliance that comes only from years of study and experience. When we reflect on the Battle of Vienna today, more than 3 centuries later, there are lessons that transcend its specific historical context. We learn about the importance of preparation, specialization, timing, and terrain in military operations. We learn about the power of inspirational leadership and personal example. We learn about the value of cooperation in the face of common challenges. And we learn that history is not determined by impersonal forces, but by the choices and actions of real people. The secret weapon that destroyed the Ottoman army wasn't just a type of cavalry or a piece of equipment. It was a combination of human, technological, tactical, and strategic factors that came together at a perfect moment. It was the product of centuries of military evolution, refinement through countless battles, and application by a master strategist who understood exactly how to employ the tool at hand. John Sobieski's Winged Hussars broke more than just an army in Vienna. They broke the Ottoman expansion drive that had continued for centuries. They saved a city, but they also saved a civilization. They changed the course of history on a sunny September afternoon, riding down the hill in immortal glory, their wings whispering a song of victory that would echo through the centuries. Today, the Winged Hussars live only in memory, in paintings and statues, in history books and legends. But the memory of what they accomplished remains powerful. They remind us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, victory is possible. That courage, skill, and intelligent leadership can overcome numerical advantages. That the decisive moments in history often come when least expected and from unexpected directions. And that sometimes, just sometimes, heroes truly do win, and good triumphs over the seemingly invincible threat. The Battle of Vienna was one of those rare moments when everything was at stake, when the outcome of a single battle truly mattered to the future of millions. And when the battle was over, when the smoke cleared and the sun set over the field of carnage, it was the secret weapon, Poland's magnificent Winged Hussars, who stood victorious, having saved not just a city, but an entire civilization. Their charge remains, more than 300 years later, one of the most spectacular feats of arms ever recorded. A moment when history changed direction in the time it takes to ride a horse downhill, and the world was never the same again. It is important to note that for the Christian soldiers who fought in Vienna, this was not just a military battle, but a war of faith. Before the final charge, John Sobieski and his men knelt in prayer, asking for the protection of the Lord God. The king himself proclaimed that he came in the name of the Lord to defend Christianity. After the victory, Sobieski sent a message to the Pope paraphrasing the words of Julius Caesar. "We came, we saw, and the Lord God conquered." For the defenders and liberators of Vienna, the victory was not simply the result of superior tactics or better weapons, but a demonstration of divine providence. Churches throughout Europe celebrated with thanksgiving, and the day of the battle was declared a religious feast in many Catholic countries. Regardless of their own beliefs, it is undeniable that these men's deep faith in their cause, their conviction that they fought under the protection of the Lord God, gave them extraordinary courage and determination. This spiritual dimension of the battle was as important to the participants as the military aspects, and helps explain why they fought so fiercely and never gave up, even when all seemed lost.